Picture this. It's October 7th, 1780, and you're a Loyalist militiaman standing on a rocky ridge in the Carolina backcountry. You've spent weeks hunting rebels through these mountains, burning their farms, hanging their leaders. Your commander, Major Patrick Ferguson, the best marksman in the British Army, has just told you that you're invincible. He's positioned your force of 1,100 men on top of a mountain with clear fields of fire in every direction. You have bayonets, training, and the full might of the British Empire behind you. The rebels, if they even dare to come, will have to charge uphill through your musket fire. It's a perfect defensive position. It's a fortress. Then, through the morning mist, you see them. Not an army, but a swarm. Over 1,000 backwoodsmen, frontiersmen, and mountain men emerging from the forest like ghosts. They're not wearing uniforms. They're dressed in hunting shirts and carrying long rifles. They don't march in formation. They move from tree to tree, rock to rock, like they're stalking deer. And then you hear it. A sound that will haunt British nightmares for the rest of the war. The turkey call. It's their signal to attack. Within the next 65 minutes, your perfect fortress will become a slaughterhouse. Your invincible position will become a trap. And Major Ferguson, the man who swore he'd never surrender, will be shot off his horse so many times they'll count 7 bullet holes in his body. This isn't just a battle, it's a massacre. It's the moment when the American frontier rose up and crushed the British Empire's best attempt to hold the South. This is the Battle of King's Mountain, and it will change everything. Before diving into these forgotten stories of courage and determination, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of American history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the battles that forged our nation. To understand why this battle mattered, you have to understand just how badly the American Revolution was going in 1780. This wasn't the glorious struggle you see in paintings. This was a dying rebellion, gasping for its last breath. The war had been raging for 5 years, and the Patriots were losing. George Washington's Continental Army was barely holding on in the north, surviving through sheer stubbornness and French loans. But in the South was collapsing. Charleston, the crown jewel of the southern colonies, had fallen in May. 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered in the largest American defeat of the entire war. General Benjamin Lincoln handed over his sword to the British, and with it went any organized resistance in South Carolina. The British commander, Lord Cornwallis, was convinced the South was won. His strategy was elegant in its simplicity. He would sweep north through the Carolinas, rallying loyalists to the king's cause, crushing any resistance, and then march into Virginia. From there, he'd link up with British forces in the north and strangle the rebellion to death. It was working. In August, Cornwallis sent his cavalry commander, the infamous Banastre Tarleton, to destroy the last Continental force in the South at Camden. Tarleton earned his nickname Bloody Ban that day. He shattered General Horatio Gates's army in less than an hour. Gates, the hero of Saratoga, ran so fast from the battlefield that he covered 60 miles by nightfall. He didn't stop running until he reached Charlotte, leaving his men to be slaughtered behind him. The Continental Army in the South ceased to exist, but Cornwallis made one critical error. He believed that the rebellion was purely a military problem. Destroy the armies, capture the cities, and the people would submit. He didn't understand the backcountry. He didn't understand the settlers living in the Appalachian foothills, the Scots-Irish farmers, the German immigrants, the men who'd been fighting Indians for generations. These weren't soldiers, they were survivors. They didn't need a Continental Army to tell them how to fight. They'd been doing it their whole lives. The British strategy for controlling the backcountry relied on loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to King George III. And there were plenty of them. The revolution wasn't a simple patriots versus redcoats story. It was a civil war, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. In the Carolina backcountry, the violence was personal and brutal. Loyalist militias burned Patriot farms. Patriot irregulars hanged Loyalist leaders. There were no rules, no mercy, and no middle ground. Into this chaos rode Major Patrick Ferguson, and he was different from the other British officers. Ferguson was a Scotsman, educated, brilliant, and possibly the most dangerous man in the Southern theater. He wasn't just a soldier, he was an inventor. Ferguson had designed the Ferguson rifle, the first breech-loading rifle used by the British Army. It could fire 6 times a minute in any weather, compared to the 3 rounds per minute of a standard musket. It could be loaded while lying down, while riding a horse, even while running. It was a weapon decades ahead of its time. The British Army, in its infinite wisdom, looked at this revolutionary technology and decided it was too expensive to mass produce. They gave Ferguson 100 rifles and told him to make do. But Ferguson's real genius wasn't in weaponry. It was in psychology. He understood that you couldn't hold the backcountry with redcoats alone. You needed locals. You needed people who knew the terrain, who spoke the language, who had scores to settle. Ferguson was given command of the Loyalist militia in the South, and he was good at it. He recruited hundreds, then thousands of Loyalists. He trained them. He armed them. He turned them into an effective fighting force. By September 1780, Ferguson commanded 1,100 men. They weren't regulars, but they were motivated, and they were angry. Ferguson had a message he wanted to send to the rebels. He wrote a proclamation, and he had it delivered to the Patriot settlements west of the mountains. The message was simple: submit or be destroyed. He threatened to march over the mountains, burn the settlements, hang the leaders, and lay waste to the country with fire and sword. It was meant to terrify them into submission. It had the opposite effect. The men living over the mountains weren't the kind to be terrorized. These were the over-mountain men, settlers who'd crossed the Appalachian ridges into what would become Tennessee. They lived in a world where the nearest government was hundreds of miles away, where justice was handled personally, and where survival meant being tougher than everything trying to kill you. They'd been fighting the Cherokee for their land. They'd survived raids, ambushes, and winters that would break lesser men. A British major threatening them with fire and sword wasn't scary. It was insulting. When Ferguson's proclamation arrived, the over-mountain men gathered at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River. They didn't wait for orders from Congress. They didn't ask permission from any general. They simply decided that Ferguson had to die. The muster at Sycamore Shoals in late September 1780 was one of the most remarkable gatherings in American history. Over 1,000 men showed up, bringing their own rifles, their own horses, and their own ammunition. There were no uniforms, no standardized equipment, no military hierarchy in the traditional sense. What they had was something the British couldn't understand: voluntary discipline. These men elected their leaders on the spot. Colonel Isaac Shelby from Sullivan County, Colonel John Sevier from Washington County, Colonel William Campbell from Virginia, Colonel Charles McDowell from Burke County in North Carolina. These weren't professional officers. They were community leaders, men who had earned respect through action, not through a commission purchased in London. The force they assembled was unlike anything in the Continental Army. Every man carried a long rifle, the famous Pennsylvania rifle that could kill a man at 300 yards. In the hands of a frontiersman who'd been shooting since childhood, these weapons were surgical instruments of death. British muskets were smooth bore, inaccurate beyond 50 yards, designed for volley fire in tight formations. The long rifle was rifled, with spiral grooves inside the barrel that spun the bullet, giving it stability and accuracy. A good rifleman could hit a man's head at 200 yards, and every single man in the over-mountain army was a good rifleman. But the long rifle had weaknesses. It was slow to load. It took a skilled marksman 45 seconds to reload, compared to 20 seconds for a musket. And you couldn't attach a bayonet to it. The barrel was too delicate. In a traditional European battle, where armies stood in lines and traded volleys, then charged with bayonets, riflemen were a novelty. They'd pick off officers, cause casualties, but when the bayonets came out, they'd run. The British knew this. It's why they weren't worried about militia. Militia couldn't stand against a bayonet charge. What the British didn't understand was that the over-mountain men had no intention of standing in a line. They were hunters. And they were about to hunt Patrick Ferguson. The army that rode out from Sycamore Shoals on September 26, 1780, numbered about 1,000 men. They rode east through the mountains, following Indian trails and game paths that no British army could navigate. They moved fast, covering 35 miles in a single day through terrain that would break a regular army. As they crossed the mountains, the weather turned brutal. An early winter storm dumped snow on the ridges. The temperature dropped. The men rode through it without complaining, sleeping in the open without tents, eating parched corn and whatever game they could shoot. This wasn't an army. It was a migration of violence. As they descended the eastern slopes, they picked up more volunteers. North Carolina militia joined them. Virginia riflemen fell in. By the time they reached the foothills, they numbered over 1,500 men. They were a ragged, diverse mob that spoke with a dozen different accents and followed a dozen different colonels. But they had one unifying purpose: kill Ferguson. Meanwhile, Ferguson had no idea what was coming for him. He'd been raiding through the countryside, confident in his superiority. His scouts brought him reports of rebel activity, but he dismissed it. Militia gathering in the mountains? Let them come. He'd destroy them, like every other Patriot force he'd encountered. But then the reports became more specific. A large force was moving fast, covering impossible distances. Ferguson finally understood he might be in danger. But instead of retreating to safety, instead of falling back to Cornwallis's main army just 40 miles away, Ferguson made a decision that would kill him. He decided to make a stand. He chose his ground carefully. Kings Mountain was a rocky ridge rising 60 feet above the surrounding forest. It was shaped like a footprint, roughly 600 yards long and between 60 and 120 yards wide. The sides were steep and covered with trees and boulders. From the top, you had a clear view of anyone approaching. It seemed like a fortress. Ferguson positioned his 1,100 men along the ridge, expecting the rebels to charge uphill into his musket fire. He had bayonets. The rebels didn't. When they got close, he'd charge downhill with fixed bayonets and scatter them, like he'd done to every other militia force. It was a sound tactical plan against a conventional enemy. But these weren't conventional enemies. On the evening of October 6th, the Over-Mountain Army camped at Copens, about 30 miles from Ferguson's position. The colonels held a council of war. They'd learned that Ferguson knew they were coming and was prepared for battle. Some suggested waiting for reinforcements. Others worried that Ferguson might escape to Cornwallis if they delayed. Colonel Campbell cut through the debate with frontier logic. If we're going to fight him, we need to do it now, before he runs or before Cornwallis sends help. Pick your best men, leave the rest to guard the camp, and ride tonight. They selected 900 of their best riflemen and horsemen. They left at 8 o'clock that night, riding through darkness and rain. It was 30 miles of rough country, and they covered it in less than 12 hours. By dawn on October 7th, they were in position, surrounding Kings Mountain completely. Ferguson and his loyalists were trapped, and they didn't even know it yet. The geography of Kings Mountain is crucial to understanding what happened next. It wasn't a mountain in the traditional sense. It was a narrow, tree-covered ridge with rocky slopes. The loyalists on top could see anyone approaching, but the trees and boulders provided cover for attackers. And the ridge was long and narrow, which meant Ferguson's men were spread thin along the crest. He couldn't concentrate his force without abandoning parts of the ridge. The Patriot plan was simple and devastating. They'd surround the mountain completely, then attack from all sides simultaneously. There'd be no front, no rear, no flanks. Just a 360-degree assault. And they'd use their rifles the way they'd been using them their whole lives, from cover, picking targets, making every shot count. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the attack began. The Patriots moved up the slopes in loose formations, darting from tree to tree, rock to rock. They didn't mass in columns. They spread out, making themselves difficult targets. From the top of the ridge, Ferguson's loyalists opened fire. Their muskets roared, smoke billowed, and bullets clipped branches and ricocheted off rocks. But they were firing at men who knew how to use cover. The Patriots climbed higher, and when they got within rifle range, they stopped, took aim, and fired. The accuracy was devastating. Loyalists who exposed themselves to shoot were hit. Officers who tried to direct their men were picked off. The silver whistle Ferguson used to signal his troops became a beacon for Patriot riflemen. Every time he blew it, a dozen rifles swung toward the sound. Ferguson realized his mistake almost immediately. The ridge that seemed like a fortress was actually a trap. He was surrounded, pinned on top of a hill with nowhere to go. His only advantage was the bayonet, so he used it. He ordered bayonet charges down the slope to drive the Patriots back. And it worked, sort of. The Loyalists, screaming and running downhill with fixed bayonets, crashed into the Patriot lines. The riflemen, unable to reload fast enough and unwilling to engage in hand-to-hand combat without bayonets of their own, fell back down the slope. Ferguson's men chased them, driving them off the mountain. For a moment, it looked like the British tactic might work. But then the Patriots did something that no European army would do. They didn't break. They didn't run away. They just moved back down the hill, took cover, reloaded, and started shooting again. The Loyalists, now exposed on the slope, became targets. The Patriots cut them down with rifle fire, forcing them to retreat back up to the ridge. This pattern repeated over and over. Ferguson would order a bayonet charge. The Loyalists would drive the Patriots back. The Patriots would fall back, reload, and shoot the Loyalists as they tried to return to the ridge. Each charge cost Ferguson men he couldn't replace. Meanwhile, The attack was coming from all sides. As soon as Ferguson concentrated his men to repel an attack from the south, the Patriots on the north side would surge forward. When he shifted troops north, the east side would advance. It was like trying to hold down a dozen springs at once. Push one down, and three others popped up. And the whole time, the rifles kept firing. The Loyalists were trained to fire in volleys, standing shoulder to shoulder, aiming in the general direction of the enemy. The Patriots fought as individuals, choosing targets, aiming for heads and chests, making every shot count. The casualty rates reflected this. For every Patriot hit, 3 or 4 Loyalists fell. Ferguson was everywhere, trying to rally his men, directing the bayonet charges, blowing his silver whistle. He was wearing a checkered hunting shirt over his uniform, trying to blend in, but the Patriots recognized him anyway. He was the one on horseback, the one shouting orders, the one leading charges. He became the priority target. Multiple riflemen took aim at Ferguson throughout the battle. A bullet hit his right hand, shattering fingers. He switched the reins to his left hand and kept fighting. Another bullet grazed his side. He ignored it. He ordered another bayonet charge, leading it himself on horseback. As he galloped down the slope, at least half a dozen rifles fired at once. Ferguson jerked in the saddle as bullets struck him in the arm, in the chest, in the side. His horse, also hit, bolted in panic. Ferguson, dying, still in the saddle, was carried back up the hill. Just before reaching the Loyalist lines, he fell from his horse. His foot caught in the stirrup, and the terrified animal dragged him several yards before he came free. Major Patrick Ferguson, the best shot in the British Army, the inventor, the leader who'd sworn he'd never surrender, died in the dirt with 7 bullet wounds in his body. He never got the chance to yield. With Ferguson dead, the command fell to Captain Abraham de Peyster, a Loyalist officer from New York. De Peyster looked at the situation and saw no hope. They were surrounded, their ammunition was running low, and men were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Patriots were climbing the slopes from all sides now, closing in for the kill. De Peyster ordered a white flag raised. It was a smart decision. It should have ended the killing. It didn't. The problem was that this wasn't a conventional battle. This was a blood feud. These Patriots weren't fighting for abstract principles of liberty. They were fighting men who'd burned their homes, killed their families, and terrorized their communities for months. They'd marched 30 miles through the night for revenge. A white flag wasn't going to stop that. The first white flag was shot down. The Loyalists raised another. It was also fired upon. The Patriots kept shooting, kept advancing, kept killing. Some of it was confusion. In the smoke and chaos of battle, spread across a 600-yard ridge, not everyone could see the white flags. But some of it was deliberate. Some of the Patriots had specific men to kill, and they weren't stopping until those men were dead. The Loyalists began shouting, "Quarter! Quarter!" They were begging for mercy. Some Patriots granted it, others didn't. The fighting devolved into small, vicious encounters across the ridge. Men with empty rifles using them as clubs. Knife fights in the rocks, executions. Colonel Campbell rode through the chaos, shouting at his men to stop firing. "For God's sake, cease firing!" It's murder to shoot any more. Slowly, gradually, the killing stopped. But the rage didn't. When the smoke cleared and the Patriots took stock of what they'd done, the numbers were staggering. Of Ferguson's 1,100 Loyalists, 225 were dead. 163 were so badly wounded they couldn't be moved. The rest, over 700 men, were prisoners. The Patriot casualties? 28 dead and 62 wounded. 90 casualties total. They had inflicted a 12-to-1 casualty ratio. In 65 minutes, they had destroyed an entire Loyalist army. Kings Mountain wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. But for the over-mountain men, the victory created a new problem. They had over 700 prisoners and no idea what to do with them. They had no jails, no prison camps, no supply lines to support captives. And they were deep in Loyalist territory with Cornwallis's army only 40 miles away. They needed to move fast. The Patriots forced the prisoners to march north, back toward the mountains. The wounded Loyalists who could walk were dragged along. Those who couldn't were left behind with basic medical supplies and a prayer. The march was brutal. The prisoners were given little food and less water. Some tried to escape and were shot. The guards were the same men who'd been fighting hours before, and their hatred hadn't cooled. As they marched, the Patriots went through the prisoners, identifying Loyalist officers who'd committed atrocities, men who'd burned homes, who'd executed prisoners, who'd terrorized Patriot families. They found them. They separated them from the rest. and then they held trials. These weren't military tribunals with lawyers and procedural rules. These were frontier justice, quick and brutal. 36 loyalists were tried for murder, torture, and house burning. The evidence was testimony from survivors and witnesses. The defense was whatever the accused could say in their own behalf. The trials took hours. The verdicts were swift. 36 men were found guilty. 36 were sentenced to hang. The executions were scheduled for the next day. On October 9th, 2 days after the battle, the Patriots stopped their march and prepared the gallows. They cut down a large tree and used it as a hanging beam. They brought out the condemned men 9 at a time, put nooses around their necks, and kicked away the supports. The first 9 died. They brought out the next 9. By the time they'd hanged the 9th man in the second group, some of the Patriot colonels called a halt. Enough blood had been spilled. The remaining prisoners were spared. But 9 men still hung from that tree, swaying in the wind, a message to every loyalist in the Carolinas: this is what rebellion costs. The executions at Kings Mountain have been controversial ever since. Were they justice or murder? Were they legitimate punishment for war crimes, or were they revenge killings that violated the rules of war? The answer probably depends on which side your ancestors fought for. What's undeniable is that the hanging sent shockwaves through the Loyalist community. Men who'd been considering joining the British cause looked at Kings Mountain and thought twice. The message was clear: the backcountry belongs to the Patriots, and we don't take prisoners. The Patriots continued their march north, deeper into the mountains, eventually reaching Hillsborough, North Carolina, where they turned their prisoners over to Continental authorities. By then, they'd been marching for 2 weeks, covering over 200 miles through hostile territory without losing a single prisoner to rescue attempts. It was a logistical miracle performed by men who had no formal training in logistics. Once the prisoners were secure, the Over-Mountain men did something remarkable. They went home. They didn't ask for payment. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't try to leverage their victory into political power. They simply mounted their horses and rode back across the mountains to their farms and families. They'd left to kill Ferguson. Ferguson was dead. Their work was done. But the impact of Kings Mountain was just beginning. When Lord Cornwallis heard about the disaster, he was planning his invasion of North Carolina. He had his army on the march, confident that the backcountry was secure. The news hit him like a physical blow. In one afternoon, he'd lost his entire left wing. His Loyalist militia was shattered. The backcountry he thought was pacified was an open rebellion. Cornwallis made a decision that changed the course of the war. He retreated. He pulled his army back to South Carolina, abandoning his invasion plans. He would spend the next 3 months trying to rebuild his forces and his strategy. Kings Mountain had bought the Southern Patriots something they desperately needed: time. Into that time stepped a new commander, General Nathaniel Greene. Washington sent Greene south to take command of what remained of the Continental Army in the region. Greene arrived to find a disaster. He had fewer than 1,500 men, half of them barefoot, most of them starving. But he also found something unexpected: hope. Kings Mountain had proven that the British could be beaten. Greene built on that foundation. He divided his tiny army, sending Daniel Morgan west with light infantry and cavalry. It was a risky move, but Greene understood what the Over-Mountain men had proven. You didn't need to fight the British on their terms. You could move fast, strike hard, and disappear before they could respond. Morgan took that lesson and turned it into an art form. At Cowpens in January 1781, he used the same tactical principles as Kings Mountain: surround the enemy, use rifles to inflict casualties, refuse to break when charged. Morgan destroyed another British force, killing or capturing over 800 redcoats and losing only 12 Americans. Cowpens was Kings Mountain refined into a science. Cornwallis, now desperate to salvage his southern strategy, chased Greene and Morgan across North Carolina in what became known as the Race to the Dan. The British burned their baggage wagons and stripped down to light marching order, trying to catch the Continental Army before it could escape to Virginia. They failed. Greene's army, moving fast and using every river crossing to delay pursuit, reached the Dan River and crossed into Virginia. Cornwallis stood on the southern bank and watched his prey escape. He'd marched his army into exhaustion for nothing. When Greene recrossed the Dan a few weeks later with reinforcements, Cornwallis met him at Guilford Courthouse. The battle was technically a British victory. Cornwallis held the field, but the cost was devastating. He lost over 500 men, a quarter of his army, including many of his best officers. Greene's force, though defeated, remained intact. Charles James Fox, a British parliamentarian, famously said, Another such victory would ruin the British Army. Cornwallis, his army bleeding, his supplies exhausted, made another fateful decision. He marched to the coast, to Wilmington, to rest and refit. And then, instead of returning to South Carolina to secure what he'd already won, he marched north into Virginia. He believed he could win the war by capturing Virginia and linking up with British forces in the north. It was the same strategy he'd been pursuing since Charleston, and it was failing for the same reason. He kept treating the war as a conventional military problem, and the Americans kept refusing to fight a conventional war. Cornwallis marched into Virginia, won several small engagements, and eventually fortified himself at a little tobacco port called Yorktown. He was waiting for reinforcements from New York. They never came. Instead, George Washington arrived with the Continental Army. The French fleet arrived, cutting off escape by sea. Cornwallis was trapped. In October 1781, exactly 1 year after Kings Mountain, Lord Cornwallis surrendered his army to George Washington. The war was effectively over. Historians have argued for 240 years about which battle was the turning point of the American Revolution. Was it Saratoga, which brought the French into the war? Was it Trenton, which saved the Continental Army from dissolution? Was it Yorktown, which ended British hopes of military victory? The answer is that all of them mattered, but Kings Mountain was unique. It was the only major Patriot victory in 1780. It was won entirely by militia, without Continental Army support. It was fought by men who chose to fight, who weren't conscripted or paid or ordered into battle. And it shattered the British Southern strategy at the exact moment when that strategy seemed on the verge of success. Thomas Jefferson called it the joyful annunciation of that turn of the tide of success. Theodore Roosevelt, himself a student of military history, wrote that Kings Mountain was the turning point of the American Revolution. But perhaps the most important impact was psychological. The British had spent years dismissing American militia as rabble, cowards who'd run at the first sight of a bayonet. Kings Mountain proved that theory catastrophically wrong. The Overmountain men had absorbed multiple bayonet charges, something that should have scattered them, and they'd come back each time. They'd surrounded a superior position, climbed under fire, and destroyed a well-trained force in close combat. They'd done everything the military manuals said was impossible for militia to do, and they'd done it with a casualty ratio that professional armies dream about. The British never again felt safe in the backcountry. The Loyalist militia, the key to their southern strategy, began to dissolve. Men looked at what happened to Ferguson's troops and decided that maybe King George wasn't worth dying for after all. The men who fought at Kings Mountain went back to their lives, but their victory echoed through history. The battle became a symbol of American frontier toughness, of citizen soldiers defeating professional armies, of liberty defended by ordinary men who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Every man who served in that battle received a land grant from the government after the war, though many never claimed it. They didn't fight for land. They fought because Patrick Ferguson threatened their homes, and they fought the way they knew how, with rifles, from cover, making every shot count. The battle established a template that would be used throughout American military history. At New Orleans in 1815, Andrew Jackson used the same tactics, riflemen behind cover, destroying a professional army. In the Mexican-American War, American rifles outranged and outshot Mexican muskets. In the Civil War, the introduction of rifled muskets made the old Napoleonic tactics of mass charges obsolete, something American generals learned in blood at places like Fredericksburg and Cold Harbor. But there's a darker legacy too. The hangings after Kings Mountain set a precedent for frontier justice that troubled the young republic. The line between legitimate punishment and murder was blurry on the frontier, and Kings Mountain showed how easily victory could turn into vengeance. It was a reminder that war, especially civil war, brings out the worst in people as often as it brings out the best. The battle also highlighted the complex nature of the revolution. This wasn't a simple story of Americans versus British. It was Americans versus Americans, with the British providing support to one side. Ferguson's army was primarily American loyalists. The men they killed and captured were their neighbors, people they had known their whole lives. The revolution in the backcountry was a civil war, vicious and personal in ways that battles between Continentals and Redcoats never were. If you visit Kings Mountain today, it's a national military park. The ridge is much as it was in 1780, covered with trees and rocky outcrops. Walking the trail that circles the battlefield, you can see how steep the slopes are, how thick the cover is. You can understand why Ferguson thought it was a fortress and why the Patriots used it as a trap. There are monuments to both sides, recognizing the courage of men who fought for opposing causes. At the summit, there's a marker showing where Ferguson fell, where the silver whistle stopped blowing, and the British Southern strategy died with it. The National Park Service has done an excellent job preserving the site and telling the story. But standing there, looking at the peaceful forest, it's hard to imagine the violence that erupted on that October afternoon. It's hard to picture 900 riflemen swarming up these slopes, the smoke, the screams, the bodies falling through the trees. The story of Kings Mountain is the story of the American frontier character, self-reliant, violent when necessary, unwilling to submit to threats. These weren't sophisticated politicians debating liberty in Philadelphia. These were hard men who'd carved farms out of wilderness, who lived by hunting and died by violence. When the British threatened them, they didn't appeal to Congress or wait for the Continental Army. They grabbed their rifles and rode to war. They fought the way they'd been fighting Indians and wild animals their whole lives, with skill, ruthlessness, and a complete disregard for conventional military wisdom. And they won. Not because they were better disciplined or better equipped than the British. They won because they understood the terrain, because they could shoot straight, and because they were too stubborn to quit even when bayonets were coming at them. Major Patrick Ferguson was a remarkable man who died for a losing cause. He was brave, innovative, and absolutely committed to the British Empire. His rifle design was brilliant. His tactical skills were proven. His loyalty was unquestioned. But he made two fatal mistakes. First, he threatened men who don't respond well to threats. Second, he chose a battlefield that favored his enemy's strengths over his own. The ridge at Kings Mountain was perfect for riflemen firing from cover and terrible for bayonet charges. Ferguson chose it because it looked like a fortress from military manuals. He should have chosen ground where his cavalry could operate, where his numbers could be brought to bear, where the Loyalists could fight the way they'd been trained. Instead, he gave the Over-Mountain men exactly the battle they wanted, a shooting match from cover at close range. It killed him. The colonels who led the Patriot forces at Kings Mountain deserve recognition beyond what history has given them. Isaac Shelby would later become the first governor of Kentucky. John Sevier became the first governor of Tennessee. William Campbell returned to Virginia and died young, at 49, his health broken by years of frontier warfare. These men weren't professional soldiers. They were community leaders who stepped up when their people needed them, who led from the front, and who went back to civilian life when the crisis passed. That tradition, the citizen-soldier tradition, became fundamental to American identity. The idea that ordinary people, when threatened, can organize, fight, and win without waiting for professional help is deeply embedded in American culture. Kings Mountain is where that idea was proven. The Over-Mountain men who fought at Kings Mountain were Scots-Irish, German, and English settlers who'd moved beyond the edge of colonial society. They were poor by the standards of coastal cities. They had no formal education. Many couldn't read or write, but they knew how to survive in a hostile environment, and they translated those survival skills into military effectiveness. They didn't need drill sergeants to teach them how to shoot. They'd been shooting since they were children, putting food on the table. They didn't need tactics manuals to teach them how to use terrain. They'd been hunting in these mountains their whole lives. All they needed was a target and a reason, and Ferguson gave them both. The result was one of the most lopsided victories in American military history, achieved by men who the British barely considered soldiers. There's a lesson in Kings Mountain for anyone studying military history. Technology and tactics matter, but they matter less than the will to win. The Loyalists had bayonets, training, and a strong defensive position. They should have won. The Patriots had rifles, determination, and a willingness to keep coming no matter how many times they were driven back. They surrounded an entrenched enemy, absorbed counterattacks, and eventually overwhelmed them through sheer persistence. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't by the book. But it worked. The British spent the rest of the war trying to understand how they kept losing to these amateur soldiers, these militia who shouldn't have been able to stand against professional troops. They never figured it out. The answer was simple. The Americans were fighting for their homes, and people fight harder for home than for empire. The Battle of Kings Mountain demonstrated that the American Revolution was more than a political movement. It was a popular uprising, a genuine rebellion by ordinary people who had decided they'd rather risk death than live under a government they didn't consent to. The men who climbed that ridge weren't doing it for philosophical abstractions. They were doing it because Ferguson threatened to burn their farms and hang their leaders. But in defending their specific homes, they were defending the principle that government requires the consent of the governed. When that consent is withdrawn, when the people decide they're done with the current system, changing it requires force. King's Mountain was that force made manifest. It was the backcountry saying, "We're done with the king, we're done with your threats, and we're done with you." The execution of the British Southern strategy didn't end at King's Mountain, but that's where it began to unravel. Cornwallis spent the next year trying to recover what he'd lost in that one afternoon. He won battles, he captured ground, but he could never quite recapture the momentum he'd had before Ferguson died. The Loyalists, who'd been rallying to British colors in the summer of 1780, were gone by the spring of 1781. Some were dead, some were prisoners. Most had just gone home, unwilling to risk ending up like Ferguson's men, shot to pieces on a ridge or hanged from a tree. The British Southern strategy depended on Loyalist support, and King's Mountain killed that support more effectively than any political argument or propaganda campaign could have. In the grand sweep of the Revolutionary War, King's Mountain was a small battle. Fewer than 2,000 men participated. The casualties, while lopsided, weren't large by the standards of major engagements. There were no famous Continental Army units involved, no celebrated generals, no dramatic turning points that artists would paint for centuries. But it mattered. It mattered because it happened at exactly the right moment, when the British seemed unstoppable in the South. It mattered because it was won by militia, proving that the Continental Army wasn't the only force capable of defeating British regulars. And it mattered because it broke the psychological hold the British had over the southern backcountry. After King's Mountain, the Patriots knew they could win. The Loyalists knew they could lose. That shift in perception changed everything. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the mountains where ordinary Americans became legends. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of King's Mountain and the frontiersmen who refused to be conquered, please hit that like button. It helps this channel survive and bring you more stories from America's military history. Make sure you're subscribed and have the bell notification turned on so you don't miss our next documentary. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the hangings after the battle were justified, or did they cross a line? Does the end justify the means in war, or are there some things that shouldn't be done even to the enemy? Let's discuss it down below. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about the courage of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their country needed them most.